If you've been in the video gaming scene for the past 30 to 13 years, you likely have heard of licensed video games. What I mean by licensed video games are video games based on previously existing properties such as a television show, movie, comic, literally anything that wasn't already a video game. These games have made up a large chunk of a system's library since the Atari 2600. However, as of recent, licensed video games have fallen into obscurity, having fewer and fewer video games being released each year than even 10 years ago. And not many know why this is, so in this story I'll explain the rise and fall of licensed video games and what caused it, and perhaps the potential rise again. Licensed video games have been a staple of video gaming culture since nearly the beginning. The earliest licensed games that I can recall were produced for the Atari 2600, titles such as the Raiders of the Lost Ark game and the infamous E.T. game. Oddly enough, E.T. is actually credited to causing the crash of the video gaming industry in 1983, though definitely not single-handedly. I think people blow that out of proportion on that part. However, it was the straw that broke the camel's back for the already struggling Atari. Yet, despite this, after Nintendo resurrected the industry with the NES, licensed games still continued to flourish and still weren't of very good quality. Some examples include Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Beetlejuice, and Back to the Future for the NES. In fact, the only good one that anyone remembers was DuckTales, now thinking about it. As time would come to pass though, companies would actually begin to put in real effort in creating licensed titles. Sure, there were still some bad ones like Home Improvement, Bebe's Kids, and Shaq Fu, but devs actually started to put in real effort this time around. Games such as Aladdin on Genesis, Toy Story 2 on N64 and PlayStation, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, Harry Potter, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and the world-famous GoldenEye 007. Licensed video games began emerging from their lackluster origins on the Atari to now becoming some legitimate juggernauts on the PlayStation and N64, and that's when things started getting crazy. The sixth generation of consoles, that being the GameCube, Xbox, and PlayStation, was the absolute heyday for licensed titles. Simpsons Hit and Run and Road Rage, SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom and the movie game, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1 and 2, Kingdom Hearts, Star Wars Battlefront, Knights of the Old Republic, and Rogue Squadron, Tony Hawk's Underground, so many good games. I mean, there were some not-so-stellar games during this time as well, such as Simpsons Skateboarding, Pimp My Ride, but I would even go to say that over half of the licensed titles around this time were of decent quality. Leading the helm of this was the company THQ, now known as THQ Nordic. They published a large amount of licensed games and had a mostly good track record because of it. Now, with all of these great things, what could possibly go wrong? With the introduction of the 7th generation of consoles, the once flourishing licensed games started to wane in popularity. Firstly, on average, most people above the age of 12 saw these games as a simple cash grab, and most of the properties adapted were meant for children. That's why most of these games have only been talked about as of recent for nostalgic reasons. Secondly, though the quality of the games drastically spiked during the 6th gen, the games were still a pretty mixed bag. For every hit and run, you would get an Enter the Matrix or a Bratz game or something. They weren't consistent in quality, that's for sure. Third, the big juggernaut behind most of these games, THQ, fell into bankruptcy during this generation. Thanks a lot, U-Draw. And fourth, and perhaps the biggest one, the rise of smartphone gaming. It's easy to laugh nowadays at the prospect of smartphones taking over gaming, but back when it was fairly new, many people were legitimately concerned over it and its probability. As licensed console titles started coming out less and less, more mobile licensed titles started to come out. I mean, everyone has a phone these days, and just making a dinky game for mobile devices with ads or microtransactions is both a cheaper and more effective way for companies to license out their IPs for games. Licensed games were still being made for platforms and were even good too. Games such as Truth or Square, Deadpool, South Park Stick of Truth, the Telltale games, and the Batman Arkham games were all pretty solid. At the beginning of the 8th generation of consoles, you barely got a new licensed game that wasn't a sequel to Batman. However, as of the past few years, licensed games have been making somewhat of a comeback. I think it really started with the explosive success of Spider-Man on PS4. It was a big hit for that console. I think it's starting to make companies realize that games can still be profitable. Now Square Enix is making an Avengers game, there's a new Marvel Ultimate Alliance game coming out, and last but certainly not least is the upcoming SpongeBob Rehydrated. So here's to hoping for another renaissance of these types of games. Make sure to drop down a comment below as to what licensed games you loved to play back in the day, and which ones you want to get the rehydrated treatment. I really appreciate your feedback, and as always, I will see you in the next one.